Julian slid the envelope across the oak table as though it were a business transaction. His eyes avoided mine, fixed instead on the window where the late Texas sun bled across the pecan orchard. When I unfolded the paper inside, I saw the neat script of the bank check $10,000. My throat tightened. Not at the number, but at the insult it carried. "You'll be better off in town," he said, his tone brisk, impatient. "An apartment in San Antonio, maybe Austin, somewhere quiet. This ranch is too much for you now." I let the silence stretch between us. $10,000 for 40 years of soil under my nails, for the land that had raised 2 boys and carried me through widowhood. I set the check down carefully, as if it were a fragile thing, and looked at my son. "So this is what I'm worth to you." Julian shifted in his chair, smoothing the lapel of his suit. He had never looked comfortable here, not in boots or in the dust. "Mom, it's simple. $6 million from the sale, invested already. You won't have to worry again." The arrogance in his voice struck me harder than the numbers. $6 million. And he believed 10,000 was enough to erase me from the very soil I had bent my back to tame. My fingers curled around the check once more, but instead of tears, a laugh slipped out low, steady, unexpected even to me. Julian mistook it for surrender, and relief softened his face. He couldn't know that a week earlier I had sat in a lawyer's office, signing papers he had no idea existed. The ranch was not his to sell, and soon he would learn just how little control he truly held. When I first arrived in Fredericksburg, I was 27 and already a widow. My husband's accident on the drilling site left me with 2 small boys, a pickup with more rust than paint, and $100 tucked inside my purse. I remember driving down Main Street, past the limestone storefronts the Germans had built a century before, wondering if this place could give me more than pity. The land I bought wasn't much 60 acres of stubborn soil and a weather-beaten barn, but it was enough to hold a dream. At dawn, I planted pecan saplings with blistered hands, willing them to take root. I raised calves and sold them at the stockyards in San Antonio, loading the trailer myself, the boys watching from the cab. When droughts came, I stretched feed, prayed for rain, and worked 18-hour days so my sons never went hungry. Each fence post carried my sweat, each pasture my blood. The calluses hardened, my back bent, but I built something that could not be bought from a catalog or handed down from a bank account. It was mine because I earned every square foot with my own body. Owen seemed to understand this. As a boy, he woke early to feed the chickens, asked questions about soil and rainfall, and carried pride in chores that kept us afloat. Julian, though, was different. Even at 12, he would hold a ledger pad and ask, "Mama, how much is this worth? What's the price for all these cows? When will this land be mine?" His curiosity wasn't about the work, but about the value he could extract from it. I told myself he would grow out of it, that city ambitions would fade when he felt the grit of real labor. But years passed, and while Owen studied agriculture at Texas A&M, Julian drifted into schemes, quick profits, and debts I quietly covered. Now, sitting with that insulting check on my kitchen table, I felt the full weight of the contrast between my 2 sons. One had learned the worth of sweat, the other saw only dollar signs where my soul had taken root. And it was Owen's quiet voice, trembling 1 week earlier, that warned me of what Julian planned next. It was Owen who came to me first, his face pale, his hands shaking as if the words themselves burned to be spoken. He had driven in from College Station late at night, his truck still dusted with the red clay of the back roads. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger, balancing feed costs against the latest cattle sale, when he leaned across the wood, and whispered, "Mama, I heard Julian on the phone. He's planning to forge your signature." At first, I thought I had misheard. That exhaustion was twisting his words. But Owen pressed on, his voice breaking. "He told the lawyer you were too old, too forgetful to notice. He said the ranch already had a buyer, and he was ready to cash out. $6 million. Mama, and he wants you gone." My chest tightened, but I didn't let him see me falter. I had lived through too much to crumble at my own table. "Thank you, son," I told him, though the words carried more weight than he could know. "Now we prepare." The next morning I drove to San Antonio and walked into the office of Claire Mendoza, a lawyer whose name had been passed to me by a neighbor who lost her land in a similar scheme. Claire looked me straight in the eye, her handshake firm, her manner brisk but warm. She didn't talk to me like I was fragile. She spoke as if I were a businesswoman worth protecting. "We'll move quickly," she said. "An irrevocable trust. Your name as lifetime beneficiary? No one can sell without your approval." Her pen scratched across papers that felt heavier than any deed I had ever signed. By the time I left, the ranch was shielded behind legal armor Julian couldn't pierce. At Claire's suggestion, I also allowed her team to install discrete cameras, one in my home office, another in the county clerk's building, where Julian might try to file fraudulent documents. The thought of watching my own son caught on film made me sick, yet necessary. By the week's end, the trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for Julian to walk into it. Julian called 3 days later, his voice smooth with triumph. "Mom, I've booked us a table at Biga on the banks in the Pearl District. It's time to celebrate. I want this to be a farewell worthy of you." The words dripped with condescension, as though he were granting me an honor. I listened without interruption, the phone warm in my hand. He truly believed the ranch was his, that my silence had meant surrender. "Of course, Julian," I answered calmly. "A farewell sounds lovely." My agreement pleased him so much I could hear the smile over the line. When I set the receiver down, I went to my closet. Hanging there was the red gown I had worn on my 60th birthday. That night had been filled with neighbors, music, and laughter in the barn lit with strings of white bulbs. Julian hadn't stayed long business calls, he'd said, but Owen had danced with me until midnight. I had kept the dress pressed and ready, a reminder that age hadn't stolen my pride. I laid it out across the bed and ran my hand along the fabric. If Julian wanted to see a defeated woman, he would instead see the matriarch he had underestimated. The day of the dinner, I prepared carefully. Pearls my late husband had given me for our 20th anniversary, hair swept back, makeup subtle but sure. In the mirror, I saw not a victim, but a woman carrying 40 years of grit, ready to face her own son across a polished table. On the drive into San Antonio, the pecan groves blurred past, then the limestone storefronts of Fredericksburg, until finally the towers of the city rose ahead. My heart beat steady, not with fear but with resolve. Beside me on the seat rested Claire's leather folder, its contents waiting for the right moment. By the time I arrived at the Pearl District, dusk was settling over the river walk. Lights twinkled on the water, and people strolled by with the easy air of tourists. Julian was already inside, no doubt rehearsing his speech about smart investments and my comfortable future. I adjusted the gown, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the door, knowing the real feast would be the truth waiting to be served. Julian rose as I entered, pulling out my chair with a flourish. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, a gold watch catching the light of the chandeliers. To anyone else, he might have looked like a successful businessman treating his mother to dinner. To me, he looked like a boy hiding mischief behind polished shoes. "Mom," he said warmly, "I'm glad you agreed to this. Tonight is about celebrating the future. Menus were barely opened before he launched into his speech. The ranch sold for $6 million. I already moved the money into an investment that will double in 5 years. You don't need to worry about details. But I've set aside $10,000 for you to get settled in San Antonio. A quiet apartment. No more chores. No more stress. He pushed an envelope toward me with the same casualness he might use to pass a tip to a waiter. I tapped the envelope, then looked up. $6 million, I said evenly. And I am worth 10,000. For a moment, his smile faltered. But he quickly covered it with a confident chuckle. Mom, you're not looking at the bigger picture. I'm securing our legacy. That was when he reached into his briefcase and slid a stack of documents across the linen tablecloth. Your signature, he said, tapping the page. Proof you approved the sale. I told you it was all legitimate. I studied the papers. My heart steady, not racing. The signature bore my name. But the curves were stiff, the loops foreign. I set them back on the table. That is not my hand, Julian. Before he could reply, a shadow fell across us. Claire Mendoza appeared, her presence quiet but commanding. She carried a slim leather folder and greeted me with a nod before turning to my son. Julian Hartwell, she asked. His brow furrowed. Who are you? I'm your mother's attorney, she said calmly. She opened the folder, laying out pages one by one, certified copies of my authentic signatures spanning 4 decades. Surveillance photographs of Julian in his office, and records exposing the so-called buyer as a false identity. Julian's fingers trembled as he reached for the evidence, his confidence unraveling with every page he touched. I watched him, silent, as the mask he had worn so proudly began to slip, piece by piece, until only fear remained in his eyes. Claire's voice cut through the polished clatter of the restaurant. The buyer your son speaks of, Javier Montenegro, does not exist. He is an alias attached to shell companies tied directly to Julian. The funds were funneled into speculative cryptocurrency accounts now under federal investigation. His assets are already frozen. Julian's face drained of color. He fumbled for his wine glass, spilling a crimson trail across the white tablecloth. That's impossible, he muttered. It was supposed to be clean. Montenegro was real, the investment airtight. Claire leaned forward, her tone even merciless. We have records of every transfer. You created a false identity to mask theft. What you call an investment is already flagged as fraud. Regulators will want answers. For a moment, silence pressed down on us, broken only by the low murmur of diners unaware of the drama unfolding at our table. I studied my son, the sweat at his temples, the hands that once held my own as a boy, now trembling over stolen millions. Mom, he whispered hoarsely, I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I could grow the money, prove I wasn't a failure. His words were shards of desperation, meant to pierce my resolve. Claire placed a hand lightly on my arm. Mrs. Hartwell, you have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges tonight. Document fraud, elder financial abuse, wire fraud. The penalties are severe. My chest tightened. The boy who once chased calves barefoot in our fields now sat before me as a man cornered by his own greed. I could let the law devour him, or I could give him one final path, narrow and steep. I folded the check for $10,000 and pushed it back toward him. You will return every cent left, sell what you own, and work the ranch without pay for a year. No privileges as my son, only labor, under my rules. Fail, and the courts will finish what you started. Julian's shoulders sagged. He nodded slowly. The mask shattered beyond repair. I reached for my purse, gathering Claire's documents. already thinking of dawn when the real sentence would begin. Julian arrived back at the ranch with nothing but a duffel bag and the sagging posture of a man stripped of armor. The tailored suits and polished shoes were gone. Claire had seen to that. What remained was a son who now slept in the small bunkhouse where seasonal hands once stayed. I gave him no keys to the main house, no privileges beyond a plate of food at the end of a long day. The first morning, I woke him at 5. The same hour I had risen for 4 decades. He stumbled through the dark toward the stables, blinking like a child unused to dawn. By mid-morning, his hands were raw from mucking stalls, the blisters swelling along soft palms that had never truly worked a day's labor. He winced, but said nothing. The days followed with steady rhythm, patching fences that stretched over rocky fields, pruning pecan trees under the fierce hill country sun, hauling feed until his shoulders sagged. At night, he collapsed into the bunkhouse cot, muscles stiff, breath ragged. The other workers, families who had been with me through drought and harvest, eyed him with suspicion. They spoke in Spanish he barely understood, muttering about the patron's son who thought he was too good for calluses. They gave him the hardest tasks, the dirtiest corners of the pens. To my surprise, he accepted them without complaint. Weeks passed, then months. His skin darkened with sun, his body toughened, and slowly the workers' laughter shifted. One morning, I caught old Mateo clapping him on the back after a long stretch of fence work. Respect, grudging but real, had begun to surface. Watching from a distance, I measured each change not in words, but in sweat. Julian was learning that worth was not in ledgers or schemes, but in the rhythm of hands against earth. Still, I guarded my heart. Blisters could harden into calluses, but I knew too well how quickly pride could return. And even as he labored, the shadow of the lost fortune lingered, a reminder that restitution was far from complete. By autumn, the investigators delivered their report. Out of $6 million, less than $800,000 had been recovered from the shell accounts and fraudulent trades. The rest was gone, scattered through offshore wallets and phony companies that would never face justice. I read the letter in silence, the numbers etched like scars across the page. Julian stood beside me, head bowed. For once he didn't try to explain or excuse himself. He only said, "I'll earn back what I can." It was not enough, but it was more than I had expected. In the evenings, after the day's work in the fields, I began to notice a change. Instead of disappearing into town, Julian sat on the porch steps with dog-eared manuals borrowed from the Extension Office irrigation techniques for pecan groves, soil studies from Texas A&M, guides on rotational grazing. He asked me questions about root depth, rainfall cycles, the old water rights I'd fought for decades ago. For the first time, his curiosity turned toward building rather than taking. Still, I kept my guard. Respect earned in sweat could be lost just as quickly in arrogance. I answered his questions carefully, neither cold nor forgiving. My trust had been fractured, and I knew it would take more than a season of study to mend it. Owen visited often, his arms folded as he watched his brother mend fences or climb ladders to trim branches. "He's different," Owen said cautiously one evening. "But don't let him think it's enough yet." I nodded, grateful for his steady presence. The son who had carried me through the first shock of betrayal. As the leaves turned and pecans began to drop heavy into their husks, I saw Julian gathering them with a diligence that surprised me. He worked not for profit, but with something closer to reverence. Perhaps money could vanish into the void, but labor left its mark on the land, and slowly, I began to see it leaving its mark on him. When winter settled over the hill country, Claire drove up from San Antonio with a folder in her hand and a measured smile. She had tracked every month of Julian's labor, every transfer of restitution funds, Every compliance form signed without hesitation. He has met the conditions, she said plainly. No defaults, no hidden accounts, no attempts to undermine the agreement. I sat across the table from Julian, the memory of forged papers still sharp in my mind. He looked different, now sunburned skin, hands rough with scars, shoulders hardened from a year's weight of work, yet his eyes carried something I had not seen since he was a boy. Humility. I won't give you back what you thought you stole, I told him, sliding a new document across the table. The ranch remains in trust, but if you want to stay, you'll do so as a junior partner with capped salary, full oversight, and no authority over assets. Your work will earn your place, not your birthright. Julian's hands trembled as he signed. Tears welled, but he blinked them back, whispering, "Thank you for believing I could be more than what I was." That evening, I cooked venison stew and cornbread, setting the table with care. Owen joined us, wary but willing, for the first time in years. The three of us ate without resentment, poisoning the air. Conversation lingered on the orchards, the cattle, even old memories of childhood summers when the ranch was still new. I watched them both across the table, one steady as oak, the other bent but beginning to straighten. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not fully, but it was something sturdy enough to build on. When the plates were cleared, I stepped outside into the cool night, the sound of crickets rising, already thinking of what the next sunrise would demand. A year passed, measured not by calendars, but by dawns. Each morning, I heard Julian's footsteps before mine, the bunkhouse door creaking open, his boots crunching toward the stables. He no longer needed reminding or prodding. The rhythm of work had claimed him. On the first morning of spring, I walked the pastures as the sun lifted over the pecan trees. In my pocket lay the faded check for $10,000, edges softened by time. I carried it not as a wound, but as a reminder of how close I had come to being erased from my own land. The orchard spread wide before me, branches heavy with promise. Julian moved among the rows, inspecting irrigation lines, speaking quietly to the hands who now accepted him as one of their own. Owen was home for the weekend, leaning against a fence post, watching his brother without the old bitterness. I paused at the fence line, feeling the soil beneath my boots. For 40 years, I had poured myself into this ranch, every acre a ledger written in sweat. What remained after betrayal was not measured in dollars lost, but in boundaries held firm, respect reclaimed, and lessons carved into the marrow of my sons. Inheritance, I realized, was not land or money. It was the strength to demand dignity, the courage to protect what you built, and the resolve to teach by example. One day this ranch would pass on, but only under the weight of honesty and earned labor. As the sun climbed higher, I folded the old check and slid it back into my pocket. Julian lifted his head and met my eyes. For the first time in years, the silence between us carried not resentment, but respect.